Hi, today we're going to read a small excerpt from Guilty Deceptions. After I finished my smoke, we headed out to Brunswick House. It was a small cheap hotel that was on Prince William Street. Instead of taking the buggy, we walked. The hotel might have been cheap, but it was very warm and welcoming. It was a cozy 3-story house with a lush lawn that was surrounded by a white picket fence. We walked up the path and entered the front door, finding ourselves in a vast entry hall with a small desk right in front of us. Behind the desk was an older lady wearing a black alpaca dress and white apron. She tied her snow-white hair in a bun. The woman was reading a battered copy of Sense and Sensibility. She hadn't noticed that we came in, and so I cleared my throat. She glanced up. "May I help you, boys?" she asked. "We are looking for Mrs. Baxter," I said. She smiled and nodded. "I'm Mrs. Baxter. How may I help you?" she asked. "We have a few questions for you about a former guest. She would have stayed with you last fall. Her name was Mrs. Clark," I said. "Oh, I remember her all right," she said. "She's strange." I narrowed my eyes. "Strange?" I asked, and peered at Mrs. Baxter. "What do you mean by strange?" She arrived out front with 2 men. One was the larger man, the other rather skinny. She said, "Well, that's not so strange," I said. The large man came in with her. However, I could recognize the thin man even with his back turned. "He was the architect, John Riley," she said. "Did she mention what business she had here?" I asked, and Mrs. Baxter shook her head. "No." Mrs. Clark was silent and mysterious, she said. "Great," I said. "I asked plenty of times about her husband. She refused to answer," she said. "Really?" I asked. Mrs. Baxter nodded. She made herself scarce after the first night. She was avoiding my questions. "You were asking her questions?" I asked, and Mrs. Baxter nodded. "Yes," she said, and lowered her voice. "The child resembled Mr. Riley. However, Mr. Riley was a married man, and this was not his wife. It piqued my interest, you see." "So you were fishing for information?" I asked. She kept feeding me this story, saying that her husband would arrive soon, but no man ever arrived to my knowledge, she said. "So no man stayed in the room with her?" I asked. Mrs. Baxter winced. "Well, yes and no," she said. She glanced at me, and a sigh escaped her mouth. "How can it be both?" I asked.